So 3, 2, 1, go. Okay. Hello, everyone. So this is a panel discussion. My name is Pavel Shigelsky, and I will be the moderator of this panel. This panel will discuss. We will discuss the question: mobile app testing. Does it matter? It's quite a wide question, and we will try to focus on the main points here and try to answer. And before we start, I want to introduce our speakers, our panelists that will answer all the questions and try to concentrate and try to resolve the problems. So please, Krzysztof, can you start? Introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Krzysztof Zabłocki, and I am a lead iOS developer at the New York Times. I do a lot of open source, and because I do a lot of open source, I write a lot of tests. Otherwise, I would just not be able to maintain it.
Yeah, great. So one by one, then Eugene.
Hi, my name is Eugene Metsuk. I'm a software expert at Kaspersky Lab, and I'm a Google developer expert. And I'm one of the authors of Kaspresso. It's a library that is devoted to Android tests. Yeah, it's this library is like a wrapper of Espresso and UI Optimator to make developers happy, for example. So just visit our GitHub page.
Great. Then Valera, please introduce.
My name is Valera Zakharov. I am a tech lead of the mobile developer experience team at Slack. So before that, I worked at Google on Espresso and other testing tools for Android.
Okay, great. And Rob, please.
I'm Rob Napier. I work for Jaybird Sports, mostly on earbuds, and most of my focus is on low-level issues like Bluetooth, networking, security, cryptography. So, and I maintain some open source packages around cryptography. I maintain a crypto format called REncryptor.
Okay, great. We have very good experts here in panel. So yeah, I hope we will discuss a lot. But we have only 30 minutes, 30 minutes for discussion. So I will start with just a very short, controversial question to you. Like I heard so many times that on the market there are different types of companies, like outsourced companies that do the projects for money, fixed price projects and everything, and there are the kind of product companies, and both of them they have kind of their own stages and engineering practices inside while developing the projects. What do you think about the testing? Does it matter for them? Is it like there any difference between like those companies and how they adopt this testing? Do they need it or not? So yeah, please try. So you can go. We'll start.
I don't think anybody is going to could just write a lot of code, compile it, and ship it without running it. I mean, is anybody taking that position? I mean, so we all test. I mean, I don't think there's anyone who doesn't test.
I think that I would ask the question like, how long is your code going to live? How long do you plan for it to live? If you plan for it to live for more than a prototype, like for more than a few months, then you should think about and write tests. Because it comes down to code quality at the end, and not only will you be catching bugs in the future, but it's like, is your code going to be structured well and going to be? It's like, think of it as if you're building a building. If you want that building to exist in the future for many years, then you want there to be some sort of structural integrity to it, and I think testing provides that structural integrity.
But there are very few. I mean, buildings are a great example. Buildings are based on following specifications and following best practices. And there are specific kinds of tests, but there's no automated tests that run in a building if I go in and put in a new door, there's not like an automated test suite that runs against the building, right? I use other practices to make sure I don't need to do that.
Yeah.
And I never go back and like regression test the entire building because I'm installing a new window. So I think actually buildings are a great example but I think the question here is testing. The question on the docket was testing. What you described is automated testing that kind of, with scripts. Those aren't the same thing.
There's one thing that I want to mention is I like the building and the real architecture analogy. There's one major difference between what they do, what the architects of buildings do, and what we do, because once a building gets approved, when you get the approval from the city and everything else, no one goes and tells you to completely throw out what you did and redo it from scratch, which is absolutely what happens for us many times, right? As someone that
I just had my entire kitchen rebuilt. I mean, like gutted.
Yeah, but you didn't
got to the walls and
didn't do the fundamentals of your building, right? Whereas we often do get asked to change. Like
I had to have a giant post put in with new concrete to hold up the attic. I mean, yeah, they changed out the foundation. My grandfather, my wife's grandfather, dug a basement under his house. An existing house. I mean, yeah, they change foundation all the time.
It's doable, but it's not a common practice. Whereas for us, obviously, it happens a little too often, right? That's the nature. But so for me, that question, it isn't just about testing. It's architecture as well. Like when I led agency, there's something I always talk when I talk about architecture is when you work in an outsourcing company. What often happens is you develop 1.0 version of the app and then it's out of the door. When you do that, it's very short-sighted because you cannot evaluate whether your architectural choices were the good ones, because that only comes with time as you get those change requests, right? Because the first version is usually pretty stable. You evaluate an idea and then you might get major changes to the app because that didn't work. But when you are outsourcing and you only do 1.0, you don't get to evaluate whether your architecture was a good one, whether it's flexible, whether it's upgradable. And the same with testing. You can get away with manual testing because you will only work on this app in a limited amount of time. Whereas when you work in a product company and you have to maintain the app for 5 or more years, testing that you did from the beginning, automated testing, I mean, will keep growing, right? The test that you wrote originally, the longer the project runs, the longer those tests run, the value of them goes up, obviously. So that's for me, that's the biggest difference between those two approaches.
I worked on code bases that were over 20 years old that were almost exclusively manual testing. Some of my first jobs for Nortel were on code bases that started out in 1969. And I was working on them in the 90s. And it was pretty much exclusively manual testing. There was some automated stuff, but it was because it ran on phone switches. You had to actually run it on a phone switch. So I don't think it's the length of time it exists. Almost all the products I've worked on, because they're heavy networking things, they have complicated problems. I mean, I work on earbuds, right? Bluetooth earbuds. Write me an automated test case. I keep trying. I've tried for years. But the way that we solve it is we've got two folks who have stacks of these things, every product we've ever made, and they try it. And they try it on every phone, every time we release.
So you mean that?
And they're very good at it.
So you mean that not any project should do testing, like should write unit tests or automation tests in functional or non-functional?
Oh, I have tons of automated tests. I use them to write code. So I'm all into test-driven development. Like I build tests to make sure that I know what problem I'm solving. Like to say out loud, this would be the problem I'm solving. And they're great for my parsers. I write all kinds of test cases around those. Once it's working and running, I find 90% of what I really need is to make sure the product still works. And the only way you really make sure the product still works is to test it against the kinds of things that it does. So if you build APIs, yeah, you can often build a lot of things against APIs. But if you build user-facing UI-driven code, eventually you have to actually have people touch it. There are some things to have robots do it, but eventually something is actually touching the screen.
But I think that's actually a great. I used to be very much, automate everything, and I've come around to value high quality exploratory manual testing. I think that having automation in place to automate scenarios that are trivial or can be automated frees up those people to actually do more interesting manual testing. So like for Slack, for example, I would want our manual testers to go in the metro and try out interesting things.
There, yes.
Yeah. So those are the kinds of things we can't automate, and having automation in place frees up those people to do that kind of stuff. That's how I view it now.
So question for everybody. When was the last time your automated test suite found a bug that wasn't a bug in the test suite?
It happens all the time.
That after you ship. Okay, so yeah, then you have a valuable one. I have had that very, very rarely. So I'm just curious how people have that. I mean, usually like a bug that was written or a test case that was written more than 6 months ago finds a bug in your changes.
We recently had a case where we have a test flakiness problem on our iOS test suite because tests were not written at the start and they were kind of retrofitted later to a bad architecture, which is why you should start with tests. And we had a flakiness issue where users were reporting that sometimes when they were typing into text boxes, the spaces would get deleted. And I'm not an iOS guy. I don't know the details, but basically it manifested as flaky tests, but it was actually a user issue. There was some kind of a global state variable that was like observing the text fields and was deleting the spaces. And, it wasn't being removed properly on one of them. And so, this is the kind of stuff. Yeah, it pops up all the time. So
if I understand though, the story is you had tests, they were failing. You didn't trust them,
yeah.
And then I know, and you didn't trust them. It waited until users declared it, and then you found the bug. I'm asking for cases where the bug was actually found by the test.
I think that happens. I think that scenario happens quite a lot when you refactor. That's where I find a lot of value of automated testing, having the confidence to do a bigger change refactorings without breaking the existing code. That's where the old tests that you wrote will, if they fail when you refactor and you are not supposed to be changing features, that means that they did their job. Because unlike when you create new code, when you go, red, green, refactor, when you refactor existing code, it should not be failing, right? The test should not be failing. So if the tests are not flaky, they're written correctly, they will have a lot of value in those situations.
I often, before I do refactors, do some quick test creation for that, but they're sanity tests. So one of the problems is I've done massive refactors. Every system I've been in, I've eventually rewritten the whole thing one step at a time. We keep shipping the whole time, but I'm constantly rewriting it. Having thousands of test cases has always burned me because when I do a refactor, because it really limits what kind of refactoring you can do. If you're changing something deep, like how the system works, now all your tests, because your tests are all going to have all kind of little understandings of it, you wind up having to rewrite thousands of tests. And so what we've done in every case is delete them because they weren't really helping. I mean, I did refactors from C to Go. I mean, I rewrote an entire program, one piece at a time, from C to Go. How would my unit tests help me?
I think that happens to a lot of people, that situation, when you go too fine-grained with testing. That's why I like BD.
Yeah.
That's why I like behavior-driven testing rather than TDD. TDD is amazing for libraries. Agreed. When you have a small library that has a simple job, like for example, Sorcerer is all TDD. There's just no way I'm gonna, test code generator manually. That's just not gonna work. Yeah. So for a small library that has a very specific job, TDD works great. For applications, I find behavior-driven testing far more valuable because you only focus on first of all, you limit the public API as much as you can because then you have to write less tests, but also you only test the actual end results, right? The scenarios that you're supposed to support. And by doing that, you avoid testing implementation details. Like the worst test you can do is when you basically you rewrite your implementation detail in test. You are too fine-grained. Those tests are terrible. That's why a lot of people don't like testing, because they do this. This is an anti-pattern testing, right? Because if you are leaking that implementation detail into your test, that means every time you want to actually do that refactor, every single test has to change. There's zero value in those tests. It's actually a negative value, in my opinion. That's why BDD is far better.
But the problem is, when we talk about code coverage, that's the thing we get pushed towards, because it's easy to do code coverage with those kinds of tests, as opposed to focusing on, I'm writing a test because I really care about this. Like, I need, for instance, when the application launches, it goes to the main screen. That's really important. And I would like to make sure every time I do something, I didn't accidentally break that. Those tests make sense. A function returns, like, I do a setter and then I get it and make sure that the getter works on the set. It's like, stop it. It's like, stop writing those tests. Or testing basic logic that, it's like, if I change this logic, the whole program wouldn't work. There's no reason to test that logic all by itself.
Well, I saw people writing tests for something that the language guarantees. Like, literally. Like, that's just stupid. The other thing is, it's like with documentation. When we started rewriting the Times Up, one of the rules someone come up with is that everything has to be documented. And then we had documentation on functions that literally just repeated the interface. They had zero value. In fact, when you have the situation like that, it's just noise. And when you get a lot of noise, people ignore it. So when you see that everything has documentation, but that documentation only has value 1 in 100 times, you stop reading it. Whereas when you document things that are actually valuable, and it's only there if it's valuable, everyone reads it. Because,
What were we trying to do? I mean, and that's the biggest thing, is that functions that what the function does is not particularly helpful. The code tells you what it does. The question is, what did you mean it to do? Right? Why did I write this function? Why did I write this whole model? I always want block headers at the top of objects that say, what the heck is this object? And then it makes sense to write some tests that make sure that that object is those things. But writing tests on every function.
I would challenge a bit. Like, I was I heard that the rumor that programmers, they do not like to write tests because it's really dull work. So they don't want to write it. They just write it. They write the code and they create a feature and then they ship it, and that's fine. That's fine. But they do not like to write tests. What we can do with it?
I don't know. I love to write tests. It's so satisfying. It's like the most satisfying thing ever.
So I think that we have to split off the two main topics. First of all, it's a unit testing. So we were discussing about a lot of unit testing. It's so big area really where we can discuss, I think, a long time. But I think that the main topic today is automative test. It's a UI test. Yeah, UI test. So it's a test that imitates a user behavior. Yeah, and it's two, I think, different areas. And Pavel said that the writing of UI of the native tests for developers is done or something else. I don't agree with you. I don't know. So for me, it's very interesting where you just find this opinion on something else, because for me, the writing of auto test or UI testing it's a big challenge. Yeah, and developers can refuse. Sorry. Just 1 minute. And developers.
Oh, no. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah. Okay. And developers can refuse it only for several reasons. So first of all, because these tests are not replaced in your IDE, in your project. You must switch off on another project to write another test. And all of this, it's a very time-consuming thing. You just need, for example, to write tests on another language, for example, Ruby, or something else. If we say we tell about Appium, And all of these just annoy developers, and that's why developers refuse. But if you write tests in your IDE, if you write tests that are connected to your project, if your waiting time is, for example, around 1 minute, if the result of tests on your local machine in your infrastructure is the same, all of this is great, and all of this will force developers to write tests. Yeah, but if developers have flaky tests, and the main reason of flaky tests is your infrastructure, is bullshit. Really, is bullshit, and developers must reject it. So if you can guarantee that all of this will work, and developers will write tests, and it will not a problem. It will not a problem.
I would challenge the original question. I don't think people don't write tests because they find it boring. I think they don't write tests because they never learn how to do it right, and they run into all those issues we discussed before. Flaky the test, duplicating the implementation detail, which means they have no value. In fact, they remove value. Those are more common, in my opinion, because to really learn how to write tests correctly, you have to spend some time writing wrong tests, unless you have a good teacher, right? But you need to experience those pain points to realize like where the value is, like doing those high-level tests, more BDD approach rather than TDD for application. When it comes, like, we are not only talking about UI tests, like the, let's say, Xcode UI test, really slow. That's not really good way to do test-driven behavior. I totally agree with Eugene that your test suits need to run really fast. If your test suite runs a minute, that's way too long for TDD. Like, what I do is I modularize. I modularize as much as I can, then I can have test suite for each module. Then when I work on a specific module, the test cases run extremely fast. That's the only way to do real TDD, because if you have to wait minutes between the changes, then it's just not gonna do TDD because it's just not efficient. You have to have quick feedback to actually be, find it very valuable. When you learn those things, when you understand those things, how to write tests, how to avoid anti-patterns, what tests give you is a lot of value, because you are no longer blocked. Like, for example, if you have multiple teams, right? Someone is doing the backend, you are doing the front end, and now I often finish my feature before the backend even gets like in the half of their implementation. And the only thing I need from them is agreement of how the API will work. I mock everything. I implement the whole native layer. Then when they say that they are finished, I just switch to the production and verify that they're adhere to the contract that we agreed on. But I can work much faster than if I didn't do testing. Because if I didn't do testing, I didn't mock things. Obviously, I could mock it without tests. But if I didn't do that thing, I would have to wait for them. And so I would be wasting time. Whereas I can already be implementing those features. So I think that when people say they don't like testing or they don't find value testing, all those issues we talked about briefly, those are the reasons. Not because it's boring. It's not boring when you do it right. It's extremely valuable. It makes you faster. It makes you more efficient. It's really hard. And also when you do TDD, your architecture ends up being better more often than not, because when you use code, like when you write tests, test-driven development, you actually use interfaces that don't exist yet. So you can how it will look, whether it feels right. And that gives you a lot of value in my opinion.
So, Christoph, I think that...
I agree during early...
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Only one. I think that TDD doesn't work with UI testing. Absolutely. No. Writing UI tests with TDD is not really. And I think that you have to consider UI testing like the last part of feature writing. Yeah, when you write your feature.
Can we call it integration testing, because that's more what we're talking about?
With that.
I think there are two levels. Like you can test like for example, if you do MVVM, you can test all of the user actions that they have the correct behavior without ever touching the UI. Whereas the thing that would be,
I don't think that's true. That's true. I mean, you can test that you believe it will work, but I promise you, when you then put it again, when it's used in anger, it won't work.
I mean, you can test user behavior, but it doesn't mean that your application actually works. You still need those integration tests. But what I mean is that you can still do TDD with that approach, but then integration testing absolutely doesn't work. It's just too slow. It's just way too slow.
I mean, yeah, if you take TDD as the true, like, I'm going to write the small test and write the code, write small tests, it's difficult to do with UI testing. I think that Google and Apple still have some work to do on the speed of that. I think that Swift UI and Compose are going to help that a lot, hopefully. But I think that you absolutely can write, like when you're writing, say, an Android activity, and you can write just a simple shell test, like an espresso test that launches your activity. Then you add a button, or you add some layout, you add a sanity like layout test just to make sure you're not breaking while you're iterating. I think that you can be fairly pragmatic. It's not a test that you're going to run obviously like super frequently, as frequently as a real unit test, but I think it has value as you're developing your screen. So I'm a big proponent of those single activity, single screen UI tests that are kind of like unit tests for that are hermetic, isolated from all the other screens and system level functionality, the network, and all of that. So I think that can be done.
But they're valuable. But they're valuable while you're developing. Where I tend to run into trouble is when they're thought of as being valuable in perpetuity, such that they become maintained code. One of the problems with tests, with complicated tests, is they're just code. You get to a point where the tests need tests, right? You don't know that the moment you think you need a testing, like you need helper, like complicated helper functions, or heaven forbid, if you think you need to do abstractions in your tests, you're just writing another program.
No, the kinds of tests I'm talking about are tests that will exercise the UI just like a user would.
Right.
And what I mean is that's okay. It's essentially, it's like they validate a contract, just like an API test, but in this case, the API happens to be visual. And you could totally overdo it. I think I agree with that. But I think, having at least one test per screen that can launch your screen and make sure that all your either MVVM or MVP is wired up correctly and your screen doesn't crash, even that alone has a lot of value. And then maybe you have a few simple validations on a screen. I'm not talking about, of course, going like super deep. Yeah.
No, and that's kind of my point, is that especially during development, it's very, very useful to help you develop, right? And afterwards, they can make useful smoke tests. But the trouble comes, for instance, with these screens, when you're trying to make them, for instance, pixel perfect. People who do screenshot testing, and folks like, I think Facebook does this, but they have entire departments, probably larger than people here are pretty big teams, but I mean, that are larger than many companies' entire development staffs. They have people just focused on this aspect of testing. So, okay, maybe they can do that. But the trouble is, you go from iOS 13 to iOS 14, and things change. All kinds of little things change. It's like, are those wrong? No, they're not wrong. Do I need to rewrite every test?
I think I think we can all agree that screenshot testing sucks.
Okay. When they introduced the color gamut, right? When they changed the color gamut on the iPhone, you had to re-record every screenshot you had.
Are you? Yes.
Sorry, guys. I have to stop you because we have only several minutes to finish our panel discussion. I know it's very hot topic, really, but we have to come up with some conclusions regarding our panel discussion. And I know that we can continue it later and maybe in the chat, because there are so many questions people are asking us, and I want to make a short summary out of our panel discussion and maybe ask you one question that people were asking us in this Q&A. So the summary is the following: that TDD can help you to write unit testing and to build your feature from scratch. It will help you to analyze the business requirements and everything, right? And the UI testing can help you as well to validate the user experience and validate all the behavior that user will do with your feature. Am I right or not? Can you please help me with it?
There is definitely a lot of value in test-driven development. The test-driven development makes more sense for smaller pieces of software, like a library that has a very specific purpose. If you're working on a big-scale application, you probably find more value in behavior-driven tests because they test more of a high-level overview, and they avoid a lot of the. Basically, I treat behavior-driven development as the best practices of TDD evolved. And so you test minimal public interface, you test what is the expected behavior, you avoid testing the implementation details. UI tests obviously have a lot of integration testing has a value. It's much harder, much more complicated than test-driven development in general. And like Rob said, I agree that the behavior over long periods of time is probably diminished over BDD tests.
Okay.
My parting thought would be that and this is Krzysztof also mentioned this, is that testing is a natural forcing function for good code and good architecture. If testing is hard, something is wrong in your app architecture, most likely. So that's, don't view it only as a quality assurance thing, view it as a development tool. Okay,
good. And we have 1 minute for one question. There is voted one question that is voted TDD for juniors. Is it okay or not?
Oh, for juniors too?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm confused. I'm confused by the nature of the question. Why would it be different? I mean,
I don't know. Yeah, just have it. Okay. And the last.
Only if you have.
Yes, I think our software engineering practice is still very nascent. It's still a young discipline, and of course, we will eventually, all junior developers will learn testing, probably as they learn development. But it's still not there.
I think.
But TDD is good. I do want to say TDD is good in the way that creating functions is good, right? It doesn't mean every single thing you ever do should be a function. It doesn't mean that this is good programs have functions. It's well, they have functions because that's kind of part. It's what we do. TDD shouldn't be seen as you are doing the TDD. It's a set of things that all programmers should learn how to integrate into their system.
I heard a good quote, and that quote being that it's far easier to start and learn things the right way rather than to unlearn the bad things and then learn it the right way. So if you're a junior, if you have people that are more experienced, learning from them what are the best practices probably make your life easier rather than doing on your own, doing the things incorrectly and then having to unlearn them to learn the proper ways. So if you work in a team that has senior, more people more experienced, use it. It's value for you.
Okay. Good. Thank you very much for this panel discussion. I see so many beautiful details, good details about the testing and the attitude to the testing. I hope that our audience got the main point here from our discussion. And I want to thank all of you for taking part in this amazing panel discussion. And this discussion is quite hot, I see, and I hope we can continue discussing this question in the chat, so the people will also try to involve in this discussion. Thank you very much, and I will end it right now. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Just in 8, 7, 6 seconds, we'll stop. Okay.